At 25, she should have been dancing at barn raisings, not lying broken in the Mojave sand. Her clothing hung in tatters, her body marked with the cruel evidence of violence that haunts your worst nightmares. Dust had settled into every line of her face, and her parched lips told the story of days without water. There she was, curled beneath dried palm leaves that had been carelessly tossed over her like she was nothing more than desert refuse. Travelers would have ridden past without a second glance, another tragedy claimed by the unforgiving wilderness. But Thomas Miller wasn't most men. When he brushed away those brittle fronds, his heart nearly stopped. Life still flickered behind those half-closed eyes. What escaped her lips wasn't a plea for rescue. It wasn't a cry for help. Instead, she whispered words that hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Bury me here." Not rescue, not salvation, just the final rest she believed she deserved. Those 4 words shattered something inside Thomas that had been carefully held together for years. He stood frozen, looking down at this destroyed young soul, and suddenly the specters of his past came rushing back like a flood. He'd done his share of burying during the war too, many innocents among them now. Imagine yourself in Thomas's weathered boots. Your beloved wife lies cold in her grave. Your only child, Mary, has fled to some distant place where your failures can't reach her. Every sunrise brings nothing but empty silence as you tend livestock beneath a sky that couldn't care less whether. You draw another breath. Then fate drops this broken girl at your feet, a girl whose family was torn apart by men who once shared your campfire. And she's not begging for mercy. She's asking for dirt to cover her bones. What choice do you make? Do you mount your horse and leave her to the vultures? Or do you stay there on your knees, hands shaking, knowing that pulling her from death's doorway means confronting demons you've spent years trying to silence? Thomas felt his chest constrict as he studied her ravaged face. All those years of isolation and desert dust weighing on his soul suddenly seemed trivial compared to the power of those whispered words. He could have walked away. Nobody would have judged him for it. The desert swallows the unwanted every day, but something deep inside rebelled against letting her become another forgotten casualty. Perhaps he glimpsed his wife Emily in her features. Perhaps the Almighty was offering him one final opportunity to tip the scales toward righteousness. Thomas knelt, gathering her fragile form into his arms, feeling how little was left of her strength. With every step toward his waiting horse, he understood this was no chance encounter. He wasn't simply rescuing a dying stranger. He was carrying the living proof of sins he thought he'd buried in the past forever. The sun was painting the horizon crimson when Thomas reached his modus. Spread outside Tucson, nothing impressive, a couple of weathered barns, a simple cabin that had seen better decades. He placed her on a rough cot and offered water from his dented tin cup. For the first time he watched genuine color seep back into her pallor. Told him her name was Clara Dawson, though she spoke it like something stolen from her piece by piece. Between careful sips and labored breathing, her story emerged in fragments. She'd grown up far from this desolate place, in a peaceful settlement that vanished in flames when she was barely old enough to understand loss. Her parents died in a single horrific night, their entire world reduced to smoking ruins. From that moment, she'd drifted from one set of cruel hands to another, until she was finally traded to a brothel in Tombstone. She gave a bitter laugh, explaining it was no house at all, just a prison where men paid for what remained of her broken spirit. Thomas sat in the corner, hat resting in his lap, each word striking him like hammer blows to his ribs. These stories weren't foreign to him. He'd helped create stories exactly like this one. During those war years, he'd ridden alongside men who reduced entire communities to ash, who abandoned women and children to starve among the ruins. He'd convinced himself it was necessity, that orders were orders, that war demanded such brutality, but now here sat living evidence that the flames they'd kindled hadn't just consumed buildings. They'd scorched through the life of a girl who'd barely taken her first steps when the soldiers came. Clara remained unaware. Not yet. All she saw was an aging man who offered water and shelter and for the first time in memory kept his fists to himself. She even managed a fragile smile through her swollen features, and that small gesture wounded Thomas more deeply than all her visible injuries combined. Because he knew something she didn't, the blood staining her past might very well match the blood on his own conscience. This brings us to a question that'll keep you glued to your seat. What happens when your savior turns out to be the architect of your destruction? That single question carries enough weight to change everything, because you and I both understand that buried truths have a way of clawing back to the surface. Peace never lasts long for men trying to live quietly with heavy secrets, just days. After Clara could navigate the cabin without assistance, the thunder of approaching hooves shattered the ranch's tranquility. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his hand instinctively moving toward the weathered colt hanging by the entrance. The rider reined in hard, dust swirling in the afternoon heat. Earl Simmons. Everyone in Tombstone knew that name, and none spoke it with fondness. Tall, snake-eyed, and proud of never earning an honest dollar in his miserable life, he made his living dragging women back to that house of horrors in town. He dismounted with theatrical slowness, spat a brown stream into the dirt, and fixed Thomas with a predator's grin. "Where's she hiding, old-timer?" His drawl carried the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation alone. Thomas remained silent, studying Earl from beneath his hat's shadow. That wordless stare carried more menace than any shouted threat. Earl shifted uncomfortably. He was used to men who averted their eyes and stepped aside when trouble came calling. But Thomas Miller stood his ground like bedrock. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low and steady as winter wind. "She doesn't belong to you anymore." "Turn around." Earl forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You think you can keep what's mine? She's got debts to pay back where she came from." Thomas descended from the porch, moving into the dusty yard. His hand drifted, near the Colt, not drawing, not yet. He didn't need to. His posture communicated everything. This man would not lay another finger on Clara while Thomas drew breath. The tension stretched tight as piano wire. For endless moments, only the wind, rattling the barn door and Earl's saddle leather creaking broke the silence. Earl's smirk gradually faded as he recognized something cold and final in Thomas's eyes, something that warned him this wasn't a battle worth fighting today. Muttering curses, Earl hauled himself back into the saddle. "This ain't finished," he snarled, then spurred his horse toward Tombstone in a cloud of bitter dust. Inside the cabin, Clara had heard every word through the thin walls. She clutched her blanket by the window, eyes wide with disbelief. Nobody had ever defended her before, not once in her entire existence. The sound of those hoofbeats disappearing felt like the world finally giving her room to breathe. Thomas closed the door and sank heavily into his chair, mind racing. He knew Earl's breed. They never accepted defeat gracefully. They gathered allies, nursed grievances, and always returned with reinforcements. Thomas could feel it in his bones. The trouble wasn't leaving, it was just regrouping. If this story has caught hold of you, now's the perfect time to subscribe. These frontier tales only grow more intense from here, and I guarantee you, the journey ahead is worth every dusty mile. The desert keeps its promises, even the dangerous ones. Less than a week had passed since Earl Simmons departed with threats on his lips, and already his promised revenge materialized. Thomas first noticed the acrid smell of smoke during his evening chores. He burst from the cabin to see flames consuming his hay barn, sparks dancing skyward on the hot desert breeze. 3 riders were disappearing into the darkness, their mocking laughter echoing across the wasteland. Thomas raised his Colt but lowered it again. Shooting blindly into the night would only waste ammunition. Instead, he grabbed a shovel and battled the inferno, his lungs burning with smoke. Clara tried to help with water buckets, but their efforts proved futile. By the time they'd contained the blaze, half the structure was gone, and the air reeked of destruction. Tom had collapsed on his porch, face blackened with soot. That barn had stood for decades, built alongside his wife's father. When hope still lived in this place, the flames hadn't just consumed wood and hay, they'd devoured precious memories. The following morning brought a familiar figure, Marshal Henry Callahan, his silver beard catching sunlight, his badge gleaming against his vest. He'd served beside Thomas during the war, and now commanded as much respect in this territory as any circuit judge. After hearing Thomas's account, he shook his head grimly. "These boys won't quit, Tom, not unless someone with real authority makes them." That same afternoon, Callahan confronted Earl and his crew at Tombstone's rowdiest saloon. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey, the kind of establishment where law only entered with guns drawn and ready. Callahan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You boys torched a man's barn. That's crossing a line you can't step back over. If you want to keep breathing in my county, you're done hunting that girl." Even Earl, emboldened by liquor and bravado, knew better than to challenge Callahan directly. The marshal carried weight with both lawmen and outlaws. A word from him could turn entire towns against you. Earl scowled into his drink, but stayed silent. One by one, his companions drifted away, abandoning their glasses and their leader. Back at the ranch, Thomas delivered the news to Clara. She was protected, at least temporarily, but he could read the skepticism in her expression. She understood that men like Earl never truly surrendered. Here's what you need to remember. Barns can be rebuilt from scratch, but some fires never stop smoldering deep underground. Thomas might have won this confrontation, but the real inferno still burned in the truth he carried locked inside his chest. The barn fire died to embers, but the smoke in Thomas's soul refused to clear. Clara was secure for now, though frontier safety never lasted long. During the peaceful nights that followed while crickets sang their desert songs and the air grew cool, Clara began probing into his history. Initially, Thomas deflected her questions, focusing intently on his cattle, the stars, anything except her penetrating gaze. But a man can only drag his ghosts so far before they start walking openly beside him in daylight. One evening beside their small fire, Clara spoke of the settlement she'd lost as a child, how soldiers had arrived with blazing torches and left behind nothing but ashes and echoing screams. Thomas stared deep into the dancing flames, and within them he saw the faces from that terrible night. Faces he'd spent years trying to forget. His voice cracked when the truth finally broke free. I was there, Clara. I rode with those men. I didn't stop what happened. Silence flooded the cabin like rising water. Clara's hands trembled, but her eyes never wavered from his. In that devastating moment, she saw not just the man who'd carried her from certain death, but also the man who'd once stood idle while her childhood world burned. Days crawled past. Clara's body continued healing, but her heart carried fresh wounds. She did care for Thomas perhaps more than wisdom suggested. She witnessed the gentleness in his weathered hands now, the way he never raised his voice, the way he gave her space to simply exist. Yet the truth had carved a scar too deep to ignore. One morning she gathered her few belongings and stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dawn. You saved my life, Thomas, she said quietly. You gave me the chance to live again, but I can't remain here. Some injuries never heal completely. Thomas nodded, his eyes damp though his expression remained steady. He knew she spoke the truth. Watching her ride toward the horizon felt like losing his wife all over again, and his daughter too. But as her figure diminished against the endless desert, he also experienced something unexpected, relief. As if the secret he'd carried had finally been spoken into the open air where it could no longer poison him from within. Out here in the wilderness, not every tale ends with lovers sharing the same roof. Sometimes the most honest endings are the most painful ones, where forgiveness comes not through staying together, but through finding the courage to let go. Maybe that's the wisdom hidden within this story, that a person isn't defined solely by their worst moment, that redemption can live in the choice to protect someone, even when the past can't be rewritten. So I'll ask you directly, what would you have done in Thomas Miller's place? Would you risk revealing the truth and losing the only soul who'd ever shown you genuine kindness? If this story moved you, I'd appreciate your like on this video, and if you want to continue exploring these dusty frontier paths with me, stories of loss and redemption and the unquenchable fire of the human spirit, then subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next ride.